The house smelled of cold ash and the memory of better fires. Isobel Vane stood at the window of Thornfield Grange on a Tuesday morning in late October, holding a letter she had read 4 times and still could not quite believe. The paper was good quality, better quality than anything she had been able to afford since her father's debts were settled. And the handwriting was precise, almost surgical, as if the man who wrote it had little patience for ornament. Lord Calder of Dunmore requests the company of Miss Vane at the harvest gathering, to be held at Dunmore Park on the 15th of November. The occasion will include a formal dinner, music, and the following morning's pheasant drive. The following morning's pheasant drive. Isobel set the letter on the mantel and looked at her hands. They were not the hands of a woman who attended gatherings at Dunmore Park. They were the hands of a woman who had spent the last 3 years quietly managing an estate that no longer had the staff to manage itself. Hands that had learned to mend fences and keep ledgers and decide, calmly, which walls of the house could be left cold through winter, and which ones could not. Her aunt, Mrs. Pruitt, arrived before noon, as she always did when there was something to discuss. "You'll go," she said, before she had even removed her hat. "I don't have a horse fit for a pheasant drive. You have Apollo. Apollo is 12 years old and was purchased to pull the cart." Mrs. Pruitt waved this away. "He's sound. He's steady. You'll go." Isobel did not argue further. She had learned, in the 3 years since her father's death, that argument required energy she could no longer spare on things already decided. Her aunt had made up her mind, and somewhere beneath the exhaustion and the cold practicality that had settled over her life like frost, Isobel understood that her aunt was not wrong. Lord Calder's invitation was not a social courtesy. It was a summons. It was the kind of letter that did not come twice. The trouble was that Lord Calder of Dunmore was not a man known for patience with women who arrived at a pheasant drive on a cart horse. November arrived, with the smell of frozen earth and something damp in the north wind that promised worse to come. Dunmore Park rose at the end of a long avenue of lime trees, a great grey house set against hills that were already losing their colour, the last of the autumn bracken gone rust and amber against the pale sky. Isobel arrived at 10:30 on the morning of the drive. She had dressed carefully. Her riding habit was old, but it was well cut, and she had pressed it herself the night before by lamplight. Apollo walked beneath her with his characteristic unhurried dignity. A large, broad-chested bay who had never in his life moved faster than the situation strictly required, but who moved with a solidity that Isobel had come to appreciate more than speed. The other guests were already assembled on the gravel sweep before the house. She heard it before she had fully cleared the avenue. A ripple of sound, the particular quality of laughter that is not quite directed at you, but is not quite directed away either. 2 men near the mounting block had turned to look. One of them said something she could not hear. The other laughed again. A woman in bun dove-grey wool on a chestnut thoroughbred glanced over and then glanced away with the practiced indifference of someone who has already made their assessment. Isobel kept her chin level and her eyes forward. Apollo walked on, unbothered by any of it. She found a groom at the edge of the party and asked him to take her horse's head for a moment. It was as she was gathering herself to dismount that she became aware of a stillness at the center of the group. A particular quality of attention that meant someone important had stopped doing what they were doing to look at something else. She looked up. Lord Calder of Dunmore was perhaps 35, though he stood with the kind of self-possession that made age seem irrelevant. He was not laughing. He was looking at Apollo with an expression that was almost, not quite, a smile, and then he was looking at Isobel with an expression she could not name at all. "Miss Vane," he said. "Lord Calder, I see you've brought her." He paused. "Not cruelly." With something more unsettling, the pause of a man choosing his words with more care than the situation seemed to warrant, a dependable animal. He is that, Isobel said. Around them, the morning moved on. Someone called for the dogs. The party began to arrange itself into its moving order. Isobel settled into Apollo's steady walk and tried to remember that she had not come here to impress anyone. She had come here because her options were narrowing, and this was one of the few that remained open. The pheasant drive in the North Country was nothing like the soft, managed bat-chews she had attended as a girl. When the estate was whole, and her father's friends came up from London in their good boots, this was open country, hedgerows and stone walls, and steep bracken-covered hillsides, where the birds came up, wild and unpredictable from the rough grass. The thoroughbred horses were restless from the first hour. They were bred for it, the energy, the anticipation. And their riders had their hands full managing the fidget and surge of animals that processed every stimulus as a reason to move faster. Apollo processed every stimulus as a reason to move at exactly the same pace as before. He picked his way along the ridge with the calm deliberateness of an animal that had seen weather and difficult ground and bad days and had concluded that none of them changed much. When a pheasant went up 20 yards to his left, in a great explosive clatter of wings, he flicked one ear toward it and walked on. When a young man's chestnut spooked sideways on the loose shale of the upper field and sent him sideways out of his saddle. Caught, embarrassed, before he fully came off, Apollo merely stopped and waited for the commotion to pass. Isobel began to notice that she was not, in fact, at the back of the party. It had happened gradually, without drama. The riders who had set off most confidently had spent the first 2 hours managing horses who were burning energy faster than the terrain could justify. By midday, on the long pull-up through the high bracken to the far ridge, several of the thoroughbreds were blowing hard, their riders tight in the saddle with the focused look of people no longer enjoying themselves but unwilling to admit it. Apollo walked up the hill. He did not hurry. He did not slow. He walked with the same even, ground-covering stride he had maintained all morning, his breath misting in the cold air, his eye calm. Isobel looked up from the ridge and found that they had arrived ahead of half the party. Beside her, she had not heard him come up. Lord Calder sat on a dark bay thoroughbred that was, for the first time that morning, standing still. He was looking out across the valley below. The silver thread of the river, the grey-brown patchwork of ploughed fields, the far hills fading to blue in the November haze. He did not speak immediately, neither did she. Then, "He doesn't tire." "No," Isobel said. "He doesn't." "What is he?" "Clydesdale grandfather. The rest is difficult to say." Lord Calder was quiet for a moment. Below them, the rest of the party was struggling up through the bracken, the thoroughbreds picking their way with bad tempers and reluctant feet. "Tell me about Thornfield," he said. She looked at him. "I beg your pardon, your estate, Thornfield Grange." He had turned from the view and was looking at her directly now with the same unsettling attention he had turned on Apollo that morning. "My land agent says the eastern drainage ditch has been refitted. He says it well. I'd like to know who did the work." Isobel was quiet for a moment. "I did," she said. "Over 2 seasons. The original cut ran against the slope. It was never going to work. I redirected it." Lord Calder said nothing. "The gatehouse wall needs repointing," she continued. She was not sure why she was continuing. Something in his attention made the words come more easily than usual, and the south field wants liming. But the soil is good. The water is good. It's an honest piece of land. It just hasn't been treated honestly. He was still looking at her. "You sound," he said, "like a woman who has spent 3 years paying off the damage and beginning again." "That is," she said carefully, "an accurate description." They came down from the ridge in the late afternoon, the November light going orange and flat across the hills. The party had thinned. 3 of the younger riders had turned back at the second covert, and the woman in dove-grey wool had departed before the last drive, her thoroughbred having thrown a shoe on the upper track. Isobel had not noticed the exact moment when she stopped being at the edge of the party and began to be at its centre. But by the time they rode back down the long lime-tree avenue, with the house lights coming on ahead of them in the early dusk, she was riding beside Lord Calder, and they had been talking for the better part of an hour about drainage and soil acidity and the particular difficulties of managing hill land without adequate capital. And at some point, without either of them marking it, he had begun to call her Isobel, and she had not corrected him. The dinner that night was not what she expected. She had prepared herself for formality, for placement and precedence, and the careful social mechanics of a house where everything was a kind of performance. And those things were present, but she found herself seated at Lord Calder's left, not lost in the middle distances of the table, and he turned to her with questions that were not the questions. One asked a woman at a dinner for form's sake. He wanted to know about the drainage work. He wanted to know about the south field. He asked about the gatehouse wall, with the specificity of a man who had looked at it from the road and noticed the problem himself. On Isobel's other side, a Mr. Radcliffe, a cousin of some kind, with the particular confidence of a man who had always been given the benefit of the doubt, leaned in at one point and said, pleasantly enough, "Rather an unusual conversation for a dinner table, isn't it? All this talk of ditches." Isobel looked at him. "Perhaps," she said, "though I find the ditches rather more interesting than the alternative." Lord Calder, across the table, said nothing, but she saw the corner of his mouth move. She was in the library after dinner, alone for a few minutes before the rest of the party drifted through, when she found the estate maps. They were laid out on the large table, survey maps, recent, with pencil annotations in a careful hand. She recognized the topography, the curve of the river, the ridge, the eastern fields. She recognized the notation style. She had used the same method herself, learned from the old land agent, who had worked her father's estate before the money ran out. She was still standing over them when Lord Calder came in. He stopped, then he came to stand beside her, not speaking, both of them looking at the maps. "You're thinking about the north field," he said. "The elevation's wrong for what's planted there. You'd get better return from the south slope if you moved the boundary road." "Yes. I've been thinking the same thing for 2 years. Isobel looked up. He was closer than she had expected, and looking at her with an expression that had shed most of its careful self-possession. Not entirely, but enough that she could see something underneath it that was genuine and slightly unguarded. "Lord Calder," she said. "I think," he said, "given the drainage and the boundary road and the matter of the south field, you might manage Isobel." She considered this. "And the other direction." "Alec," he said. Outside, the November wind pressed against the library windows. Inside, the fire had settled to deep red coals, and the lamp on the table threw the survey lines into warm relief. From the hall, the sound of voices moved and murmured. Neither of them moved to join them. What Mr. Radcliffe told her, 3 days later, in a letter that arrived at Thornfield, smelling of his particular brand of cologne, was that she was misreading the situation, that Lord Calder's interest was professional, not personal, that she was making herself ridiculous, and that he, Radcliffe, as a man with certain connections and certain knowledge of the circles in which Lord Calder moved, was in a position to advise her, quietly, as a friend, to manage her expectations before she embarrassed herself. Isobel read this letter at the same window where she had read Lord Calder's invitation 6 weeks earlier. Then she set it on the fire. Not with drama, with the calm, exact movement of someone disposing of something that had no further use. Apollo looked up from the paddock outside with mild interest, then returned to the business of his hay. Lord Calder arrived at Thornfield himself, on a Tuesday morning, in December, on a dark bay horse that looked considerably more tired than its rider, which suggested he had come from some distance without stopping to rest at the convenient posting inn 12 miles east. He did not send ahead. He rode up to the door and dismounted and knocked. Isobel answered it herself, because there was only Mrs. Brack to manage the house now, and Mrs. Brack was in the kitchen. He stood in the doorway with the cold coming off him and his hat in his hand, and looked at her with an expression that was entirely without calculation. "The North Field," he said. She waited. "If I moved the boundary road, and I've been making inquiries, the simplest route goes through the east corner of Thornfield's upper ground." He paused, "which means we would either need an agreement or, Isobel said. He was quiet for a moment. "Isobel," he said, and then he stopped, because the word had come out differently than it had in the library, with a weight to it that changed what came after, so that what came after was not about the boundary road at all, and they both knew it. The cold morning light fell flat and honest across the threshold. She stepped back to let him in. The agreement they reached, about the North Field and the boundary road and a great deal more, was not completed that morning. These things never are. There were solicitors and land agents, and the particular tedium of legal instruments, and the frankly alarming discovery that Thornfield's eastern boundary had been misdescribed in the original conveyance, which required 3 months and considerable correspondence to resolve, but the fire in the library was well maintained through those 3 months. The survey maps acquired new annotations in 2 different hands, and Apollo retired from the cart he had never particularly enjoyed pulling, acquired a large paddock and a smaller companion, a shaggy grey pony of no clear breeding, who turned out to be exactly his temperament. Radcliffe was not spoken of again. He moved, it was understood, to somewhere in the south. No one missed him. The wedding was in April, when the north country finally remembered how to be green, and the lime trees in the avenue were coming into leaf, and the morning light on the hills had lost its winter severity and become something almost gentle. Isobel Vane, Isobel Calder, as she was now, stood at the window of Dunmore Park on the morning after and watched the light come up across the valley. The same valley she had first seen from the ridge in November, the river, the fields, the far hills. The house was quiet around her, not the cold quiet of Thornfield in those lean years, not the quiet of things absent and hoped for, but the quiet of a house that is simply resting before the day begins. Behind her, Alex said without opening his eyes, "The south field wants liming." Isobel did not turn around. "I know," she said. "I've already written to the supplier."